With Squad 44 unveiling its public test server essentially for the unveiling of the Pacific Theater for their game, I decided to revisit a topic I had discussed before, the addition of new fronts in Hell Let Loose. And in that video, I did talk about, at least for 2024, how they should hold off or not bring any new fronts at least until maybe 2025 or later. And I kind of want to do the other side or flip side of that argument of if they were to do a front like Japan, like what Squad 44 is doing, how could they, and how Hell Let Loose is played? Because unfortunately the games are very different, even if they have a similar genre or style to the game of milsim-like game. And my two major arguments with not bringing any new factions to the game was down to the weapon balancing. Would it actually be fun to play either faction and win? And also, how much of the game you would have to alter to make it work. And at least with this video, I think I found a way that you could make it and not change too much about Hell Let Loose. Now, to start to figure out how we can put a Pacific Theater in Hell Let Loose, you have to figure out the weapons and aspects that you could use to make a faction, and would that work against, well, any of their enemies? And not just to the point of either they would demolish the side or not, but would it actually be balanced to play either side and actually have a chance of winning as either side? That's the big thing. We saw this a lot with the British faction when they first came out, how they just got rolled by the Germans almost every match you played. It was rare to see the British truly win or hold out against the German faction, just because they had STG-44s, Panthers, Tigers, and that was more due to the British being half-baked, but I digress. And I don't think a lot of people want to go through that again, so it's important to make sure that everything is figured out at least well on day one, if there was a Pacific faction to be added. And that starts with understanding the weapons that Japan has at its disposal. In terms of small arms or guns, they're very similar to the British in that aspect. No semi-automatic weapon like the M1 Garand or Gewehr were really used in any number by the Japanese army. They have a bolt-action rifle in the Arisaka Type 99 and Type 38 models as their main battle rifles. The Type 100 submachine gun, as you see on the screen now. The Type 99 LMG, and just a wide variety of pistols and other weapons that they had during the war that were similar to British ones, at least. But from there we go into the Japanese armor or vehicle side of things, and it's not looking good. They really couldn't compare in terms of production or quality of their tanks to any of the other factions. Maybe Italy, but that's not saying much. The Hago light tank was their most produced tank of the war, and it was a light tank that was outdated from when it stepped on the battlefield against the Allies. So the thing with the Hago is that it mounted a 37mm cannon, which in theory and in some actuality, it could go up against some light tanks, but its armor was only 13mm or half an inch thick, meaning basically AT rifles could pierce right through its front armor. And it was a very slow design as well. The other tank design that would at least have some parity with Allied armor would be the Chiha or Chiha Kai. And there weren't a lot of the Chiha Kai variants where it had a long barrel 47, which means it had better penetration against Allied armor. The main Chiha series tank had a low velocity 57mm cannon that couldn't even go up against Shermans. So it's one of those things of, okay, their armor's bad, and in technicality, it would be hard to realistically show that unless you just make everything balanced, quote unquote, just from game design. And yes, you could pull designs like the Chi-Nu, Chi-Ri, and OI, but the Chi-Nu, although produced at least in some degree of mass production, did not have that many to begin with, and also they were mostly designed for the home islands. Same with the OI and Chi-Ri, but there were barely any of those tanks even made, let alone actually be able to be used for the war effort. So we're basically stuck with the Chiha designs and the Hago designs, at least to have some historical accuracy for the game. Now, while we're on the subject of tanks, we'll pivot back more towards infantry weapons and the fact of the Japanese really didn't have a rocket launcher that was produced widely during World War II. And that's a big issue for just dealing with any sort of armor that the Allies could throw at them. The main weapons that the Japanese had for anti-tank duties were anti-tank rifles, pole mines during banzai charges, the 47mm anti-tank gun that was in emplacement, then of course satchel charges. Other than that though, they really didn't have too much for anti-tank roles. So that's the one big disadvantage the Japanese would have against any other faction. With this in mind, we could take a look at the factions or nations that they could face, and we'll start at the top with China. The thing with China is they really don't have any tanks to fight the Japanese with, besides a handful of tanks they had pre-war that were mostly infantry tanks that really couldn't stand up to even the Japanese tanks. But their small arms weapons were fairly similar to the Japanese, so it really depends if you want to take armor out of the equation. For the Americans and British, I think these are the most likely countries you could face, depending on where you do at in the war. And with the Soviet Union, the Soviets rolled over the Japanese for a multitude of reasons, and superior weapons and tanks and small arms were a big factor to that, let alone just really good planning on the Soviets' part, and learning a lot of lessons from the European theater. So we'll stick with the Americans and British for this video. And even with the advantages in firepower for all the other factions minus China, there's still some battles that you could take a look at and potentially turn them into battles in Hell Let Loose, where both sides could have at least a decently equal chance at beating the other and keeping it competitive with some historical accuracy. Starting with Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal, to simplify and just give a very simple version of the history here, was essentially the start of the Allied counterattack in the Pacific to stop the Japanese from fully encircling Australia away from essentially the Americans, but at least keep them encircled in general away from supply lines and make it harder to keep Australia connected to the British Empire and just overseas trade as a whole. The Americans would essentially land a lot of troops here, catching the Japanese by surprise at first, but after the battle had started, both sides poured a lot of resources into the battle itself, both on the ground on the island itself and in the seas around Guadalcanal, resulting in several naval skirmishes that resulted in both wins and losses for both sides. In the end, the Allied armies would win the Battle of Guadalcanal after several months, but after heavy casualties on both sides. However, the thing that makes this battle in particular a battle I would use for Hell Let Loose is the weapons used. The weapons used by the Marine Corps at this time was not M1 Garands, as due to stubborn traditionalism and a distrust of the M1 Garand, only a handful of units at Guadalcanal actually had M1 Garands. The main battle rifle that the Allied Marines would have would be the M1903 bolt-action rifle used back in World War I, which would make a lot of difference in terms of just one-on-one engagements. Instead of every person in the US faction having a semi-automatic rifle like the M1 Garand, most of them would have M1903 bolt-action rifles, which would mean gunfights would be fairly equal, as the Japanese would be mostly using the Arisaka bolt-action rifle for their main battle rifle. Both sides would have a number of submachine guns or light automatic rifles, like the BAR Type 99 light machine gun, and the M1928 Thompson and the Type 99 submachine gun. The Americans also only started getting rocket launchers produced in mid-1942, so you could make the argument that only a handful of rocket launchers could have gotten to the front and or could not be used in the battle for balancing sake. So that is also on the table, at least in how I'm assessing this. In terms of armor, this would pretty much erase heavy and medium tanks from the equation for the most part. The Allies in this battle only had a handful of light tanks like the M2A4 and the M3 Stuart light tanks. The Japanese only had a handful of Hagos and Chihas available for the battle, numbering in only about a dozen tanks in general, but you could still use these in battle anyway for, say, a warfare or offensive matchup if you keep the game modes the exact same. For the commander abilities, you could keep them mostly the same in terms of the airstrikes, airheads, reinforces, and at least light tanks and maybe armored cars. But in terms of what you could add naval bombardments in the place of in-placed artillery. Since a lot of people really don't like the current army meta and want them to be maybe an off-map ability that can't be exploited by just a really good artillery player. Both sides during the Guadalcanal campaign did have some semblance of naval superiority over the other side for at least a time or two. It did swap hands every now and then, especially as the battle progressed, but each side could have naval bombardment that could be off cooldown for maybe 10 minutes or something, and you could use that as your artillery and just bombard a section for, I don't know, 30 seconds, maybe make it similar to Katusha Strike in terms of its effectiveness. I don't know, that would have to be played around a little bit, but that's just an idea I had. And at least that's how I think Guadalcanal could be a suitable map choice that would make it balanced, fun to play, and a little bit different at the same time. Another battle you could use for Hell Let Loose that would be actually bringing a new theater in the war that I don't think we've ever actually seen in a World War II shooter game, and it would be the Battle of Impal and Kohima, if I've said that correctly. To oversimplify this battle, this was a Japanese offensive in the modern-day British Raj in 1944 to essentially try to make some headway into the British Raj that took place inside modern-day India, just past the modern-day Myanmar border. The offensive went actually pretty poorly for the Japanese, as they did actually encircle some British and Indian troops, but they ended up becoming unencircled, and the Japanese lost essentially any momentum they had going into the Raj, and were on the defensive for the rest of the war. In terms of weapons, the small arms capacity for both sides would actually be fairly equal. Both sides don't have a semi-automatic rifle. They both have bolt-action rifles for their main battle rifle for the majority of their troops. And the only difference really is just the anti-tank capacity. The British do have the PIAT rocket launcher and the satchel charges and AT guns, while the Japanese have the pole mines, the AT rifles, AT guns, and satchel charges. That's really the only difference, though, if you count all that for at least the AT class, but I digress. That could be maybe balanced in some way, but that's not really the main issue here. The only issue I could see here is the tanks, but even then I'd say they're actually fairly equal to each other. The Allied side had mostly Stuart variants, whether it be the M3 and M5, and the M3 Lee tanks that were really used in this battle. And the Japanese, although they didn't have a lot of tanks in this battle as well, you could still use the Hago light tank and the Chiha medium tank to put them in for the Japanese armies, and it'd actually be fairly balanced, I would say, in terms of firepower and armor with some degree of historical accuracy. Now, you may be thinking, wait, the Lee is something that people have been asking for, but it has that hull-mounted 75 and the turret-mounted 37mm. How could you figure that out? The way I thought about this is that what you could do is the driver could operate the 75mm gun in the hull, and what you could do to balance that is you can hit a button or a key and you go into a gun sight, and you can only turn the gun, a certain degree and go up and down a certain degree. Your penalty for doing this, though, is you can't move the tank. So to use the gun, you have to be stationary. If you want to move the tank, you have to get out of the gun sight, but it'd be a very quick thing. You just hit a button, you go back to the driver's seat. But that means if you hit the reload and you swap seats, then the reload is canceled. It'd be a way you could balance it while keeping the tank in. And again, that's just one idea. If you've got a better idea how to balance it, then let me know down in the comments. But it would be a way that you could replace the hull-mounted machine gun that some tanks have for their driver and give them a gun instead. And you don't have to change the crew layout and make it to have 4 players and keep it at 3. Once again, you keep the commander abilities pretty much the same in terms of all the airstrikes, just minus the naval bombardment aspect. Overall, I think this could be a battle that you, again, could include a new group of people that have never really been represented in a World War II video game, at least to my knowledge. And it would be a front that I think people would enjoy. I do think that depending on maybe gameplay mechanics, you wouldn't see much change from the other factions, but that's just my take. Now, another question could be raised, well, why not Okinawa and Iwo Jima? Well, that's very simple. The M1 Garand exists, and how Hell Let Loose is made, this would make the Japanese have a very hard time against the American faction on these islands. If everyone thought the British had a hard time with the Germans against them in El Alamein and Drill with STG-44s, Gewehr 43s, and MP-40s, the Japanese would be in for an even worse of a time, because then every soldier they run into on the American faction would have an M1 Garand or a fully automatic Thompson, BAR, grease gun, or an M1 carbine as another semi-automatic weapon option. It would just make the Japanese completely outclassed, which is really what happened in the battles anyway. So it just makes it hard, in my opinion, to make that a fun game mode unless you make it maybe an offensive-only map where the Japanese just have every advantage because you're trying to land on Higgins boats and you're just getting hit from every which way. But besides that, you really couldn't make them into effective warfare maps, in my opinion at least. If you have an opinion on this, please leave it down in the comments below, and you got a decent discussion, I'll try to add to it, debate with you. I'll be happy to do so. But at least with what I've presented two maps that have two different theaters of the Pacific War, bring in a new sub-faction for the British that has never really been represented in World War II games to begin with, and at least gets that Pacific itch scratched, in my opinion, without making either faction totally overpowered against the other with some degree of historical accuracy. But what do you think? Is my arguments completely out of reach with everything? Or am I completely reasonable? You guys tell me. Let me know your thoughts down below. But this will probably be the last video for the year. Have a happy new year, and I'll see you next year.